When a teenage girl discovers her mother's decades-old secret hidden in a dusty attic box, she uncovers a web of lies that reaches all the way to the highest levels of their small town's justice system. As she digs deeper, powerful forces try to silence her, but they don't realize that 3 simple words in a courtroom will shatter their carefully constructed world forever. This is a story of a daughter's unwavering love, a mother's buried past, and the explosive truth that will force a respected judge to face the consequences of a decision made 20 years ago. Sarah Mitchell's hands trembled as she held the yellowed envelope, her heart pounding against her ribs. The musty air of her grandmother's attic made it hard to breathe, or maybe it was the weight of what she'd just discovered. Dust motes danced in the beam of afternoon light streaming through the small window, highlighting the tears that had begun to roll down her cheeks. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah, have you found those old Christmas decorations yet? Her mother, Rachel's voice drifted up from below, making Sarah jump. She quickly wiped her eyes, shoving the envelope into her jacket pocket. Still looking, Mom, she called back, her voice surprisingly steady despite the storm raging inside her. How could she tell her mother what she'd found? How could she explain that everything they thought they knew about their family was built on lies? The wooden stairs creaked as Rachel climbed up to the attic, each step making Sarah's pulse quicken. Her mother appeared in the doorway, still wearing her waitress uniform from the morning shift at Joey's diner. Dark circles rimmed her eyes, evidence of another double shift to make ends meet. Honey, we need to get going. I've got the evening shift in an hour and... Rachel stopped mid-sentence, noticing the open box at Sarah's feet. The color drained from her face as she recognized the old legal documents scattered across the floor. Where did you find that? Sarah pulled the envelope from her pocket, her hand shaking. Mom, why is there a court order with your name on it? And why is Judge Harrison's signature at the bottom? She paused, watching her mother's expression crumble. Who is Michael Sullivan? Rachel staggered backward, grabbing the doorframe for support. You weren't supposed to. That was buried for a reason, Sarah. Her voice cracked as tears welled up in her eyes. Please, just put it back. Some things are better left in the past. But Sarah couldn't let it go. Not now. Not after seeing the truth in black and white. Mom, this says he's my father. But you always told me Dad died before I was born. That he was a traveling salesman who got sick on the road. This is different. This is... Stop! Rachel's sharp tone echoed through the attic, making them both flinch. She took a deep breath, softening her voice. Baby, please. You don't understand what happened back then. Judge Harrison, he was trying to protect us, to protect you. Sarah felt anger rising in her chest. Protect us? By helping cover up what really happened to my father? By making it look like he abandoned us? She gestured at the documents scattered around them. These records, Mom, they tell a different story. They show that Judge Harrison ordered everything about my father sealed away. Why? Before Rachel could answer, a car door slammed outside. They both rushed to the small attic window. Judge William Harrison himself was walking up their cracked driveway, his expensive suit out of place in their working-class neighborhood. Rachel's face went pale. He knows, she whispered, more to herself than to Sarah. Somehow he knows we found it. Sarah watched as the distinguished judge reached their front door, his gray hair catching the late afternoon sun. For 17 years, he'd been a fixture at every town function, the respected pillar of their community who always seemed to take a special interest in their family. Now she understood why. The doorbell rang, its cheerful chime a stark contrast to the tension filling the attic. Rachel grabbed Sarah's shoulders, her eyes desperate. Promise me you won't say anything. Promise me you'll let me handle this. There are things you don't know, things that could hurt a lot of people if they came out. But as Sarah looked into her mother's tired eyes, she saw something she'd never noticed before. Fear. Not just worry or anxiety, but bone-deep fear. The kind that came from carrying a secret for far too long. The doorbell rang again, more insistent this time. "I can't promise that, Mom," Sarah said quietly, straightening her shoulders. "Not anymore." Rachel's eyes widened as her daughter turned toward the attic stairs, the envelope still clutched in her hand. "Sarah, wait!" But Sarah was already descending, each step taking her closer to a confrontation nearly 2 decades in the making. Judge Harrison had buried the truth once. She wasn't about to let him do it again. The front door's hinges creaked as Sarah opened it, coming face to face with the man who'd helped hide her father's fate. Judge Harrison's practiced smile faltered as he saw the envelope in her hand. "Sarah," he said smoothly, though she noticed his fingers tightening on his leather briefcase. "I was hoping to speak with your mother. Is she home?" Behind her, Sarah heard her mother's footsteps on the stairs. But 17 years of lies had created a strength inside her that wouldn't be silenced. Not this time. Not ever again. "We need to talk, Judge Harrison," Sarah said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "About what really happened to Michael Sullivan." The judge's face turned ashen, and for the first time in Sarah's memory, the most powerful man in Oak Ridge looked afraid. Oak Ridge looked different through the lens of secrets. As Sarah walked to school Monday morning, the familiar streets felt heavy with unspoken history. The courthouse loomed in the distance, its brick facade catching the early morning light. No longer just a building, but a vault of buried truths. Her weekend confrontation with Judge Harrison played on repeat in her mind. The way he'd composed himself quickly, insisting they discuss things properly in his office later that week. How he'd pulled Rachel aside, speaking in hushed tones that made her mother's hand shake. The careful way he'd asked for the envelope and the steel in Sarah's voice when she'd refused. Earth to Sarah. Emma Rodriguez's voice cut through her thoughts. Her best friend stood at their usual corner, dark curls wild in the autumn wind. "I've been waving at you for like 5 minutes. What's going on in that head of yours?" Sarah forced a smile, falling into step beside Emma. "Just tired. Mom picked up another shift at Joey's." Emma frowned, adjusting her worn backpack. "Again? That's like 60 hours this week. They're totally taking advantage of her." "Yeah," Sarah mumbled, the weight of what she knew pressing against her chest. All those extra shifts, years of struggling to make ends meet, while Judge Harrison lived in his mansion on Heritage Hill, attending charity galas and making speeches about justice. The halls of Oak Ridge High buzzed with Monday morning chaos. Sarah moved through it in a daze, barely registering the familiar faces and conversations around her. Everything felt trivial now, measured against the magnitude of what she'd discovered. "Ms. Mitchell." Mr. Parker's voice made her jump. She hadn't even realized she'd walked into his classroom early. The history teacher peered at her over his wire-rimmed glasses, concern evident in his expression. "Are you all right? You seem distracted." Sarah hesitated. Mr. Parker had always been different from other teachers. More invested, more willing to listen. He'd helped her win the state history competition last year, spending countless lunch hours discussing research techniques and proper citation methods. "I'm fine," she said automatically, then paused. "Actually, and can I ask you something? About legal records?" Mr. Parker raised an eyebrow but nodded. "Of course. That's quite a shift from your usual interest in Civil War battles." Sarah gripped the strap of her backpack, choosing her words carefully. If someone wanted to look into an old court case, something from 20 years ago, where would they start? Interesting question. Mr. Parker leaned against his desk, thoughtful. Most records that old would be archived in the county courthouse, although sealed cases would be more difficult to access. Why do you ask? Before Sarah could respond, other students began filing in. Emma threw her a curious look as she took her usual seat beside Sarah, but Sarah just shook her head slightly. Not now. The morning dragged by in a blur of lectures and assignments. Sarah's notebook remained empty, her mind too full of questions. During lunch, she sat with Emma in their usual spot under the oak tree, picking at her sandwich while her friend chatted about weekend plans. "And then maybe we could..." "Sarah, seriously, what's wrong?" Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Emma set down her apple, fixing Sarah with a concerned stare. "You've been weird all day. Did something happen?" Sarah looked at her best friend of 12 years, wondering how much to share. Emma's mother was the court clerk. What if telling her put her family at risk too? "I found something," Sarah finally said, keeping her voice low. "About my dad. About what really happened to him." Emma's eyes widened. "What? I thought he died before you were born." "That's what Mom always told me, but I found these documents in my grandmother's attic." Sarah glanced around, making sure no one was within earshot. "Emma, I think Judge Harrison helped cover something up. Something big." "Judge Harrison?" Emma whispered, shock evident in her face. "But he's like the most respected person in town. My mom says he's completely by the book about everything." Sarah pulled out her phone, showing Emma the photos she'd taken of the documents before her mother could hide them away. "Look at the dates. Look at his signature. He ordered everything about my father sealed away right after he disappeared." Emma studied the images, her expression growing serious. "Sarah, this is heavy stuff. If what you're suggesting is true..." "I know." Sarah put her phone away, the weight of it all settling back on her shoulders. "And now he wants to meet with me and Mom in his office tomorrow, to discuss the situation properly," he says. "You can't go." Emma grabbed her arm. "What if he tries to take the documents? What if he threatens you?" "I have to go. I have to know the truth." Sarah's voice hardened with determination. "My whole life has been built on lies. Mom can barely keep us afloat while Judge Harrison lives like royalty. There has to be a reason." The bell rang, signaling the end of lunch. As they gathered their things, Emma caught Sarah's arm again. "Whatever you're planning, be careful, okay? My mom always says the people with the most power have the most to lose." Sarah nodded, but her mind was already racing ahead. The courthouse archives. 20 years of buried secrets. Tomorrow's meeting with Judge Harrison. Somewhere in that web of lies and legal documents was the truth about what happened to Michael Sullivan, and why one of the most powerful men in town had gone to such lengths to hide it. As she walked to her next class, Sarah caught sight of her reflection in a classroom window. She barely recognized herself. The weight of discovery had changed something in her eyes, aging her beyond her 17 years. Tomorrow she would face Judge Harrison in his office, surrounded by the trappings of his power and influence. But Sarah had something he didn't expect, the strength that comes from finally glimpsing the truth, and she wasn't about to let it slip away again. The polished wood panels of Judge Harrison's office seemed to absorb all sound, creating an unnatural silence broken only by the steady tick of an antique grandfather clock. Sarah sat stiffly in a high-backed leather chair, her mother perched anxiously beside her. Across the massive oak desk, Judge Harrison's practiced smile didn't quite reach his eyes. "I appreciate you both coming in today," he began, folding his hands on the desk. "I think we need to discuss what Sarah found and clear up any misunderstandings." Sarah felt her mother tense beside her. The envelope sat heavy in her jacket pocket, its contents now memorized after countless late-night readings. "With all due respect, Judge Harrison," Sarah said, surprised by the steadiness in her voice. "What's there to misunderstand? The documents show that you sealed all records about my father right after he disappeared. You helped hide what really happened to him." "Sarah," Rachel's warning tone carried years of practiced submission. "Judge Harrison has always looked out for us. He's the reason we..." "The reason we what, Mom?" Sarah turned to her mother, years of questions bubbling to the surface. "The reason we barely survive on your waitress salary? The reason you jump every time his name is mentioned? That's enough." Judge Harrison's voice carried the weight of his authority, but Sarah caught a flicker of something else in his expression. Fear? Guilt? "Sarah, you're young. You don't understand the complexities of legal matters. Sometimes decisions are made to protect people." "Protect who?" Sarah pulled out her phone, pulling up the photos she'd taken. Because I did some research. Michael Sullivan, my father, was investigating corruption in the county courthouse before he disappeared. He worked for the state attorney's office. The judge's facade cracked slightly. Where did you get that information? The internet exists, Judge Harrison, and not everything gets sealed away. Sarah's hands shook slightly as she continued. I found old newspaper articles. They stopped abruptly right around the time you ordered his records sealed. Almost like someone wanted to bury the story along with him. Rachel reached for her daughter's arm. Please, Sarah, stop this. You don't know what you're doing. Actually, I do. Sarah pulled up another image on her phone. Because I also found this. A bank statement from an offshore account. My father printed it right before he disappeared. Care to explain why your name is on it, Judge Harrison? The grandfather clock's ticking seemed to grow louder in the ensuing silence. Judge Harrison's face had gone pale, but his voice remained controlled. I think we're done here. Clearly, Sarah has been misled by incomplete information. Rachel, I suggest you talk to your daughter about the dangers of making unfounded accusations. He stood, straightening his tie. I've shown remarkable patience given the circumstances, but there are limits. It would be a shame if your mother lost her job at the diner, Sarah. In this economy, finding new employment can be challenging. The threat hung in the air like smoke. Rachel grabbed Sarah's arm, trying to pull her toward the door, but Sarah stood her ground. Are you threatening us, Judge Harrison? Her voice was quiet but clear. Because that's interesting timing, considering I have a meeting with a reporter from the State Tribune tomorrow. She was bluffing, but the effect was immediate. Judge Harrison sank back into his chair, his composure finally cracking. You're playing a very dangerous game, young lady. His voice had lost its polished veneer. Some stories are better left untold. For everyone's sake. Sarah, please, Rachel pleaded, tears in her eyes. You don't understand what's at stake. Then tell me. Sarah's voice cracked with emotion. Tell me why we've lived in fear all these years. Tell me what happened to my father. Before anyone could respond, a sharp knock interrupted them. The door opened to reveal Clara Rodriguez, Emma's mother and the court clerk. Her face was ashen. I'm sorry to interrupt, Your Honor, but... She glanced nervously at Sarah and Rachel. There's someone here from the state attorney's office. They're asking about the Sullivan case. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Judge Harrison's hands gripped his desk so hard his knuckles went white. Give us a moment, Clara. His voice was strained. As soon as she left, he turned to Rachel. Control your daughter, or I cannot be responsible for what happens next. Rachel stood, pulling Sarah toward the door, but Sarah planted her feet, meeting the judge's gaze. You know what happened to my father, she said softly, and now others are starting to ask questions too. What are you so afraid of, Judge Harrison? He didn't respond, but the slight tremor in his hand as he reached for his phone told Sarah everything she needed to know. In the hallway, Rachel gripped Sarah's shoulders. Do you have any idea what you've done? Her mother whispered frantically. He'll destroy us. But Sarah's attention was caught by a man in a crisp suit walking purposefully toward Judge Harrison's office, a badge visible on his belt. Their eyes met briefly as he passed, and Sarah saw something that made her heart race. Recognition. As they hurried out of the courthouse, Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from Emma. Mom just called, said things are crazy at work. What did you do? Sarah looked back at the imposing building, its shadow stretching long in the afternoon sun. The truth about Michael Sullivan had been buried in those walls for 20 years, but cracks were finally starting to show. And Sarah Mitchell had just applied the pressure that would break them wide open. The State Tribune's offices occupied a weathered brick building downtown, its neon sign flickering weakly in the growing dusk. Sarah stood across the street, gathering her courage. Her earlier bluff in Judge Harrison's office had given her an idea. Maybe it was time to make it reality. A gust of wind sent newspapers skittering across the empty street, and Sarah pulled her jacket tighter. She'd told her mother she was studying at Emma's, but the guilt of another lie weighed heavy. Still, after yesterday's confrontation at the courthouse, she needed allies. Real ones. The security guard barely glanced up as she entered the building, too engrossed in his crossword puzzle. Sarah found the directory. Marcus Chen, investigative reporter, floor 3. Her online research had pointed to Chen as her best shot. He'd written several exposés on corruption in small-town politics, and more importantly, he'd worked in Oak Ridge 20 years ago. Maybe he'd remember something about her father's case. The elevator creaked ominously as it carried her to the 3rd floor. The newsroom was mostly empty this late, just a few dedicated reporters hunched over their desks. A man in his 50s sat in the corner office, silver-streaked hair falling over his eyes as he studied his computer screen. Sarah knocked softly on his open door. "Mr. Chen?" He looked up, reading glasses perched on the end of his nose. "We're past business hours, kid. If you're selling something, I'm Sarah Mitchell." She stepped forward, heart pounding. Michael Sullivan's daughter. The change in his expression was immediate. Chen sat up straighter, removing his glasses. "Close the door." Sarah did as he asked, settling into the chair across from his cluttered desk. Photos and newspaper clippings covered the walls, connecting stories with red string like something from a crime show. "I always wondered if you'd come looking," Chen said quietly, studying her face. "You look like him, you know." Same determined expression. Sarah's breath caught. "You knew my father?" Chen nodded, pulling open a drawer and extracting a thick file. "Michael was my source on a story I was writing, about financial irregularities in the county courthouse." He spread several old articles across the desk. "We were close to exposing something big. Then he disappeared, the records got sealed, and suddenly no one would talk to me." Sarah leaned forward, scanning the yellowed newspaper clippings. "Judge Harrison ordered everything sealed." "Harrison." Chen's expression darkened. "He was just a junior judge back then, but he moved up quickly after your father disappeared. Very quickly." "I found documents," Sarah said, pulling out her phone. "Bank statements, court orders, letters." She showed him the photos she'd taken. Chen studied them intently, his reporter's instincts visibly kicking in. "This is more than Michael ever managed to get." He looked up sharply. "Does Harrison know you have these?" Sarah nodded. "I confronted him yesterday. Then someone from the state attorney's office showed up asking questions." "Damn." Chen ran a hand through his hair. "No wonder my old contacts started calling today. Listen, Sarah, you need to be careful. 20 years ago, your father thought he'd found evidence of a massive corruption scheme, millions of dollars being laundered through the courthouse. But before he could prove it, he vanished." Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. "And I've spent 20 years trying to piece together what happened." Chen stood, moving to one of his evidence walls. "Every few years I find something new. A witness who remembers something strange. A document that doesn't quite add up, but never enough to print." He turned back to her. "Until now." Sarah felt a mix of hope and fear rising in her chest. "Will you help me? Help me find out what really happened to him?" Chen was quiet for a moment, then nodded. "On one condition, you follow my lead. No more confronting Harrison directly. These people are dangerous, Sarah. They've had 20 years to perfect their cover-up." "Okay," Sarah agreed. "But I need to know everything you know. Every detail." Chen gathered the scattered papers, checking his watch. "Not here. Too many ears. There's a diner 2 blocks down, not Joey's," he added quickly, seeing her expression. "Somewhere your mother doesn't work." As they left the building, Sarah noticed a black SUV parked across the street, its engine running. Chen saw it too, placing a protective hand on her shoulder and steering her in the opposite direction. "Rule number 1, he muttered. Always assume you're being watched." The diner was nearly empty, just a few truckers at the counter. They took a booth in the back, and Chen pulled out a small notebook. "Start at the beginning," he said. "Tell me exactly how you found those documents." For the next hour, Sarah recounted everything. The discovery in her grandmother's attic, the confrontation with Harrison, her research into her father's past. Chen took detailed notes, occasionally stopping her to clarify details. "Harrison's scared. he said finally, tapping his pen against the table. That's good. Scared people make mistakes. But what do we do next? Sarah asked, pushing away her untouched coffee. Chen's expression was grave. We follow the money. Those bank statements you found, they're just the tip of the iceberg. Your father was building a case showing how Harrison and others were using the courthouse to launder money for some very dangerous people. Is that... Sarah hesitated. Is that why he disappeared? I think so. Chen's voice softened. But Sarah, if we do this, if we really dig into this story, you need to understand the risks. These people have everything to lose. Sarah thought of her mother's tired eyes, of years of struggling while Judge Harrison lived in luxury, of a father she never knew, who died trying to expose the truth. I understand the risks, she said firmly, but I need to know what happened to him. Whatever it takes. Chen nodded slowly. Then we'd better get to work, because somewhere in this town, buried under 20 years of lies, is the truth about Michael Sullivan. And this time, we're going to find it. As they left the diner, neither noticed the figure in the black SUV, speaking quietly into a phone. She's with Chen now. Yes, sir. I understand. It'll be handled. The morning sun cast long shadows across Sarah's bedroom floor as she sat cross-legged on her bed, surrounded by paper trails and puzzle pieces. Chen had given her copies of his old case notes, and she'd spent half the night connecting dots that had gathered dust for 2 decades. Her phone buzzed. Another text from Emma. My mom's acting weird. Overheard her on the phone with Judge Harrison at midnight. Something about containing the situation. What's going on? Sarah's stomach tightened. She started typing a response when her bedroom door opened. Rachel stood there, still in her waitress uniform, looking like she hadn't slept. I know you went to the Tribune yesterday, Rachel said quietly, closing the door behind her. Mrs. Peterson saw you with Marcus Chen. Sarah's hands froze over her phone. Mom, No. Let me finish. Rachel sat on the edge of the bed, pushing aside some papers. You're so much like him, Sarah. Your father? He couldn't let go either. Couldn't stop digging once he found something wrong. Then help me understand, Sarah pleaded. You never talk about him. About what really happened. Rachel picked up one of Chen's old articles, her hands trembling slightly. Michael was passionate about justice. When he started investigating the courthouse finances, he was so excited. Said he'd found something big, but then... She swallowed hard. Then the threats started. Sarah leaned forward. Threats? From who? Anonymous calls. Warnings left on our doorstep. Someone broke into our house but didn't take anything. Just left everything slightly moved, letting us know they could. Rachel's voice cracked. I was pregnant with you. Michael wanted to keep pushing. Said the truth was worth the risk. But I was so scared. What happened the night he disappeared? Rachel's eyes filled with tears. He called me from his office. Said he'd finally found proof. Real proof. Of where the money was going. Who was involved. He was going to download everything, bring it home. She wiped her eyes. That was the last time I heard his voice. And Judge Harrison? Sarah pressed gently. He showed up the next day. Said he could protect us, you and me, but only if I stayed quiet. Said he'd make sure we had enough to get by. Rachel laughed bitterly. Enough to survive, but not enough to ever really leave Oak Ridge, to ever really be free. Sarah reached for her mother's hand. Mom, Chen thinks he can help us. He's been investigating this for years. If we work together. No. Rachel grabbed Sarah's shoulders. You don't understand. These people, they don't just make problems disappear, Sarah. They make people disappear. Your father wasn't the only one. Before Sarah could respond, her phone buzzed again. A text from Chen. Need to meet. Now found something big. Usual place. I have to go, Sarah said, standing up. Rachel caught her arm. Sarah, please, I can't lose you too. You won't. Sarah hugged her mother tightly. But Dad died trying to expose the truth. I can't walk away now. The walk to the diner felt different this time. Sarah noticed every car that passed too slowly, every stranger who looked her way too long. Chen's warnings about being watched didn't seem paranoid anymore. He was already in their usual booth, a manila envelope on the table in front of him. His face was grim. "One of my old contacts reached out," he said as Sarah slid into the seat. "Guy who used to work IT at the courthouse. Said he's been sitting on something for 20 years, too scared to come forward." Sarah's heart raced. "What is it?" Chen glanced around before opening the envelope. "Your father wasn't just looking into courthouse finances. He found evidence linking Judge Harrison to a criminal organization called the Foundation. They were using the courthouse to launder money from drug trafficking, illegal gambling, you name it." "The Foundation?" Sarah frowned. "I've never heard of them." "That's the point. They operate in the shadows, using respected community figures as fronts. Harrison was their man in the justice system, helping them appear legitimate." Chen spread out several documents. "Look at these building permits, land deals, court settlements. All perfectly legal on paper, all hiding dirty money." Sarah studied the papers, her mind racing. "And my father found proof?" "More than proof." Chen lowered his voice. "According to my contact, Michael had gotten access to their entire operation. Account numbers, names, dates, everything. He was backing it up to a hard drive when he disappeared," Sarah finished. Chen nodded. "But here's the thing. My contact swears the hard drive wasn't found when they searched his office, which means it's still out there somewhere." Sarah sat back, the implications hitting her. "That's why they're so scared now. They think I found it in my grandmother's attic." "Exactly." Chen gathered the documents quickly. "We need to find that drive, Sarah. It's the key to everything. To what happened to your father, to bringing down Harrison and the Foundation." A shadow fell across their table. They looked up to see Clara Rodriguez, Emma's mother, standing there, her face ashen. "Sarah," she said, her voice barely audible, "you need to get home. Now something's happened." "What?" Sarah stood up, fear gripping her chest. "What's wrong?" "There's been a fire," Clara said. "At your house. Your mother... Sarah was running before Clara could finish. Behind her, she heard Chen calling her name, but nothing mattered except getting home. Getting to her mother. As she rounded the corner onto her street, she saw the smoke rising into the afternoon sky. Fire trucks crowded the street, their lights painting everything in surreal flashes of red. And there, being loaded into an ambulance, was Rachel Mitchell. Conscious, but covered in soot and coughing. Sarah rushed forward, but strong hands held her back. She turned to find Judge Harrison himself standing there, his expression grave. "Let this be a warning, Sarah," he said quietly, so only she could hear. "Some fires once started consume everything in their path. Is that what you want?" Sarah stared at him, suddenly seeing not a respected judge, but a man capable of making people disappear. A man who'd buried her father's truth for 20 years, and now he'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. "You just made a mistake," she whispered, pulling free from his grip. "Because now I have nothing left to lose." The hospital corridor smelled of antiseptic and fear. Sarah sat outside her mother's room, her thoughts racing faster than her hammering heart. Rachel was stable, smoke inhalation, minor burns, but she'd recover. Physically, at least. The emotional wounds were another matter. Chen paced in front of her, running his hands through his silver hair. "We need to move fast now. They've shown their hand, they're desperate." "They tried to kill my mother," Sarah said, her voice hollow. Then with growing steel, "They tried to kill my mother." "Which means we're close to something." Chen sat beside her, lowering his voice. "Think, Sarah, your father's hard drive. Where would he have hidden it? Somewhere safe, but accessible, somewhere they wouldn't think to look." Sarah closed her eyes, trying to think like a man she'd never known. A man who knew he was in danger, but needed to preserve the truth. Mom said. She said he called from his office that night. Said he was going to bring everything home. But he never made it home, Chen finished. So either they intercepted him, or he hid it somewhere along the way. Sarah's eyes snapped open. The route from the courthouse to our old house, what was along it? Chen pulled out his notebook, sketching a quick map. Main Street, past the park, down Riverside Drive. The park, Sarah interrupted. Mom told me once that she and Dad used to meet there for lunch, said it was their special place. She leaned forward, energy replacing exhaustion. Is it still there? The old gazebo? Chen's eyes widened. You think? A public place, but personal to him. Somewhere he could reach easily, but not somewhere they'd connect to him. Sarah stood up. We need to go, now. Whoa, slow down. Chen caught her arm. We can't just walk into the park with Harrison's people watching our every move. We need a plan. Sarah thought for a moment, then pulled out her phone. Emma, I need your help. And I need to tell you everything. 20 minutes later, Emma arrived at the hospital, her dark curls wild from running. Sarah told her everything. About her father, the foundation, Judge Harrison's involvement, and the hidden hard drive they suspected might still exist. That's why Mom's been acting so strange, Emma whispered. She must know something. We need a distraction, Sarah explained. Something to draw attention while Chen and I search the park. Something big enough that Harrison's people can't ignore it. A slow smile spread across Emma's face. Leave it to me. Give me 2 hours to spread the word. Every teenager in Oak Ridge will be at that park for an impromptu protest against the school board's new dress code. Perfect. Chen nodded approvingly. Social media activism as cover for actual activism. Your father would be proud, Sarah. While Emma set their plan in motion, Sarah slipped into her mother's hospital room. Rachel was asleep, an oxygen mask covering her face. Sarah took her hand gently. I'm going to fix this, Mom, she whispered. I promise. As dusk approached, cars began filling the park's parking lot. Dozens of teenagers gathered, carrying hastily made signs protesting the fictional dress code changes. Police cruisers arrived to monitor the situation, their presence drawing Harrison's watchdogs away from their usual surveillance positions. Sarah and Chen approached from different directions, blending in with the growing crowd. The old gazebo stood on a small hill, its white paint peeling with age. As teenagers chanted and waved signs, Sarah slipped behind the structure, her heart pounding. Look for anything unusual, Chen muttered, keeping watch. Loose boards, hidden compartments. Sarah ran her hands along the gazebo's weathered railings, feeling for any irregularities. Nothing. She moved to the floorboards, pressing each one. Still nothing. Come on, Dad, she whispered. Where did you put it? Her fingers brushed something under the railing, a small mark carved into the wood, an arrow pointing up. Sarah followed its direction with her eyes, noticing a small access panel in the gazebo's ceiling. Chen, she hissed, give me a boost. He helped her climb onto the railing, steadying her as she reached for the panel. It was stuck, years of paint sealing it shut. Sarah pushed harder, ignoring the splinters digging into her palms. With a crack, the panel gave way. Sarah reached into the dark space, her fingers brushing something wrapped in plastic. She pulled it out, a waterproof bag containing an old external hard drive and a sealed envelope. Sarah, Emma's urgent whisper carried from the crowd. Harrison's here. Through the gathering darkness, Sarah saw the judge's distinctive silhouette approaching the park, flanked by 2 men in suits. She quickly stuffed the bag into her jacket. Time to go, Chen said, helping her down. Emma's got phase 2 ready. Right on cue, someone in the crowd shouted, "Water balloon fight!" Chaos erupted as dozens of teenagers pulled out balloons filled with water and harmless paint. Colors flew through the air, creating the perfect cover for Sarah and Chen to slip away. They met at Chen's car 2 blocks away, hearts racing. Sarah pulled out their prize, hands trembling as she opened the sealed envelope. Inside was a letter, the paper yellow with age. To whoever finds this, if you're reading this, something has happened to me. The drive contains everything. Proof of the Foundation's operations, Harrison's involvement, all of it. But be careful. These people will do anything to keep their secrets buried. There's more. Check the old case files from '82. It goes deeper than anyone knows. Michael Sullivan. Sarah looked up at Chen, who was already typing on his laptop, connecting the ancient drive. Can you access it? It's encrypted, he said. But your father would have used a key we could figure out. Something personal. Sarah thought of her mother in the hospital, of 20 years of fear and silence, of a father who died trying to expose the truth. Try Sarah, she said quietly. My mother was pregnant when he disappeared. He knew what he was risking, knew he might not see me grow up. Maybe he left this for me to find. Chen typed in her name. The drive whirred to life, folders appearing on his screen. His eyes widened as he scanned the contents. My God, he whispered. Sarah, your father found everything. This is enough to bring down not just Harrison, but the entire foundation. Sarah clutched the letter, her father's last words burning in her mind. Then let's finish what he started. But as they drove away, neither noticed the dark SUV pulling out behind them, its driver speaking quietly into a phone. They found it. Yes, sir. No, they don't realize the '82 files are a trap. Everything's proceeding as planned. Chen's office at the Tribune had become their war room, papers and documents covering every surface. Sarah stared at the computer screen, her father's files painting a picture more complex and terrifying than she'd imagined. Behind her, Chen was on the phone, his voice tense. Look, I need those '82 files unsealed. Yes, I know it's after hours. This is... He stopped, listening. What do you mean they're gone? Sarah turned. What's wrong? Chen lowered the phone, his expression grim. The county clerk's office says the 1982 files your father mentioned were checked out this morning, by Judge Harrison himself. He's trying to cut us off, Sarah muttered, turning back to the screen. But why those specific files? What's so important about 1982? Her phone buzzed. Emma. 911. Mom just came home crying. She's packing bags, says we have to leave town tonight. Sarah's blood ran cold. She showed the message to Chen, who immediately started gathering their materials. They're making moves. We need to... The office phone rang, cutting him off. Chen answered, his face darkening as he listened. When? He looked at Sarah. We'll be right there. What is it? Your mother's gone from the hospital, checked herself out against medical advice 20 minutes ago. Sarah was already running for the door, Chen close behind. The elevator was too slow. They took the stairs, bursting out into the parking lot. They found Chen's car with all 4 tires slashed. Walk, Chen said sharply, pulling Sarah toward the street. Hospital's only 6 blocks. They moved quickly through the darkening streets, Sarah's mind racing. Why would her mother leave the hospital? Unless... Chen, she said suddenly, stopping. What if it's not just the '82 files? What if everything, the fire, my mom, Emma's mom, what if it's all connected to whatever happened back then? You might be onto something. Chen pulled out his notebook. Your father's notes mentioned the foundation started in Oak Ridge around that time. Maybe there was another case, another investigation. A car engine revved behind them. They turned to see a black SUV accelerating in their direction. Run! Chen shoved Sarah toward a narrow alley. They sprinted between buildings as the SUV screeched past the alley's entrance, unable to follow. They emerged onto Cedar Street, out of breath. My house, Sarah gasped. Mom would go home first. But as they approached her street, they saw police cars surrounding the house. Officer Jenkins, a family friend, intercepted them. Sarah, thank God. He looked anxious. Your mother. She left a note. Said she couldn't take the pressure anymore, that she was leaving town. She's gone. A note? Sarah's voice cracked. Let me see it. Jenkins handed her a piece of paper. The handwriting looked like her mother's, but something felt off. The pressure of the pen strokes, the slight shake in the letters. She didn't write this, Sarah whispered to Chen. They forced her to. Chen studied the note. Look at the last line. Remember the summer of '82. She's trying to tell us something. Sarah's phone buzzed again. Emma. Found something in Mom's desk. Old photo. Judge Harrison with some men. Date stamp says June 1982. One of them looks like your dad. We need to get to Emma's, Sarah said. But as they turned, they saw the black SUV crawling down the street. Back door, Chen muttered. They slipped through Sarah's house, out through the kitchen. But more headlights appeared in the alley. They were being herded. This way. Sarah led them through Mrs. Peterson's yard, ducking under hedges. They emerged onto Maple Drive, seemingly clear of pursuers. Emma's house was dark when they arrived. No one answered their knocks. Something's wrong, Sarah said, trying the handle. The door swung open. The house was empty. Drawers hung open, clothes scattered everywhere. On the kitchen table, another note. Had to go. Don't trust anyone. The truth dies in 82. They're taking them all, Chen said quietly. Everyone connected to whatever happened back then. Your mother, Emma's family. But why now? After 20 years. Because of what's on that drive. Chen pulled out his laptop. We've been focusing on the financial records, the money laundering, but look at this. He opened a folder labeled Phoenix Project, 1982. Inside were partial documents, fragments of what looked like medical records. The foundation wasn't just about money, Chen said. They were running experiments, medical trials that went wrong. People died, and the man in charge. He pulled up an old photo. Sarah gasped. The man standing next to her father wasn't Judge Harrison. Harrison was there, but younger, less important. The man in charge, the man shaking her father's hand, was current Mayor Robert Phillips. The mayor's announcing his run for governor next week, Chen said. With Harrison's backing, they can't afford these secrets coming out now. Sarah's phone buzzed one last time. An unknown number. Storage Unit 23, Riverside Lock and Keep. Midnight. Come alone if you want to see them again. She showed Chen the message. He immediately started shaking his head. It's a trap. Of course it is. Sarah stared at the message. But they have my mother, Emma, her family, everyone who knows the truth about 82. She looked up at Chen. I have to go. Sarah? No. She stood straighter, her father's determination flowing through her veins. They think they can bury the truth by threatening everyone I love, but they forgot something. What's that? Sarah pulled out her father's letter, reading the last line again. The truth doesn't die. It waits. For 20 years it waited for someone to find it. She met Chen's gaze. I'm done waiting. As she walked into the gathering darkness, Sarah felt the weight of 2 decades of secrets pressing down on her. But she also felt something else, the strength of everyone who'd fought for the truth before her. Her father, her mother, Emma and her family. They were all counting on her now. The truth about 1982 was waiting in Storage Unit 23, and so were the people who would kill to keep it buried. Riverside Lock and Keep loomed against the midnight sky, a maze of identical storage units stretching into darkness. Sarah crouched behind a rusted shipping container, watching Unit 23's steel door. Her father's hard drive felt heavy in her backpack. Insurance, leverage, or maybe just proof that all of this was real. Despite her instructions to come alone, Chen was positioned at the facility's entrance, ready to call in the state police at her signal. They'd spent the last hour setting up a live stream to the Tribune's secure server, ensuring that whatever happened next wouldn't disappear like her father's evidence had 20 years ago. 11:57 p.m. The security lights cast long shadows across the gravel paths between units. 11:58 p.m. A black SUV pulled into the lot, followed by another. 11:59 p.m. Mayor Phillips stepped out, followed by Judge Harrison. 2 men in suits emerged from the second vehicle, guiding Rachel Mitchell and Clara Rodriguez between them. No sign of Emma. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. Her mother's face was tear-stained, but her eyes were clear, scanning the darkness. Clara looked shell-shocked, clutching a manila envelope to her chest. Sarah, Mayor Phillips called out, his voice carrying across the empty facility. I know you're here. Let's talk like civilized people. Sarah touched the phone in her pocket, making sure the live stream was running. One press, and Chen would have his signal. She stepped out of the shadows. "Where's Emma?" Harrison smiled thinly. "Insurance. She's safe for now. Depends on how this conversation goes." Sarah moved closer, keeping both men in view. "Let me guess. You want the hard drive." "Smart girl," Philip said. "Just like your father. Too smart for your own good." He gestured to one of his men who pushed Rachel forward. "Simple trade. The drive for your mother and the Rodriguez family." "And the truth about 1982 stays buried?" Sarah's voice carried an edge. "About the Phoenix Project?" Phillips's smile faltered slightly. Harrison stepped forward, his judicial authority a mask for something darker. "You don't understand what you're dealing with, Sarah. Some secrets stay buried for a reason." "Like what happened to my father?" Sarah looked at her mother, seeing something shift in Rachel's expression. "Or should I say, what happened to all of them?" Clara Rodriguez flinched. The envelope in her hands trembled. "Mrs. Rodriguez," Sarah said carefully, "those papers you're holding, they're from 1982, aren't they? That's why you kept them all these years. Insurance of your own." "Shut up," Harrison snapped, but Sarah saw the fear beneath his anger. "The Phoenix Project wasn't just medical trials," Sarah continued, the pieces finally clicking together. "It was cover for something else. When my father started investigating the courthouse finances, he found a connection. Didn't he, Mom?" Rachel's voice was barely a whisper. "Michael wasn't just looking into money laundering. He found death certificates, dozens of them, all from 1982, all signed by the same doctor. A doctor who committed suicide the day after your father disappeared," Phillips cut in. "Ancient history, tragic, but irrelevant." "Except it wasn't suicide," Clara suddenly spoke, her voice shaking. "I was there. I was just a clerk, new to the job. I saw—" She clutched the envelope tighter. "I saw everything." Harrison moved toward her, but Sarah was quicker. "The live stream is already running. Everything we say, everything that happens, it's being recorded. 20 years of silence ends tonight." Phillips laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You really are your father's daughter. He made the same mistake, thinking the truth would protect him. Some things are bigger than truth, Sarah. Some powers can't be touched by your little exposés." "You murdered them," Sarah said flatly. "The patients, my father, the doctor. Anyone who might expose what the foundation really was, what it still is. We built this town." Phillips's calm facade cracked. "Everything you see, the prosperity, the growth, all of it built on necessary sacrifices. Your father couldn't see the bigger picture, just like you can't." A new sound cut through the night, sirens in the distance. Harrison's head snapped up. "Robert, we need to end this. Now." Phillips nodded to his men. One grabbed Rachel, pressing a gun to her ribs. The other moved toward Sarah. But Sarah saw something they didn't. The flash of movement behind Unit 25. Emma, clutching her phone, recording everything. "You're right," Sarah said, reaching slowly for her backpack. "It ends tonight, but not how you think." She pulled out her father's hard drive. "Check the timestamp on these files. They're not from 1982. Phillips frowned. "What?" "They're from last week, from your private server. Amazing what a determined teenage hacker can do with 20 minutes in her mom's courthouse login, isn't it, Emma?" Emma stepped out, phone raised. "Live streaming to every news outlet in the state, you sick bastards." Chaos erupted. Harrison lunged for Emma. Rachel slammed her elbow into her captor's ribs. Clara threw her envelope of documents into the air, papers scattering like leaves in the wind. And through it all, Sarah heard the approaching sirens getting louder. Phillips raised his gun, desperation replacing his politician smile. "Nobody moves. This ends now." "You're right," a new voice called out. Chen stepped into view, flanked by state police officers. "It does end now." Sarah watched the mayor's facade crumble as officers swarmed the facility. She saw the moment he realized his empire was falling, not with a bang, but with the quiet click of handcuffs. Rachel ran to Sarah, pulling her into a fierce embrace. Emma joined them, all three holding each other as Harrison and Phillips were led away. "Your father would be so proud," Rachel whispered, stroking Sarah's hair. "So proud." Clara Rodriguez picked up her scattered documents, hands steady now. 20 years, she said quietly. 20 years of carrying these secrets, of wondering if I should have spoken up sooner. "You spoke up when it mattered," Sarah told her. "We all did." As the police lights painted the storage facility in surreal flashes of red and blue, Sarah thought about truth. How it never really dies, just waits for the right moment to emerge. How it takes not just courage to expose it, but the right combination of voices all choosing to speak at once. The truth about 1982 would finally be told. The foundation would crumble. And somewhere, Sarah hoped, her father could rest easier knowing his sacrifice hadn't been in vain. But first, she had 3 words for the judge. 3 words 20 years in the making. Words that would echo through the courtroom and change everything. "I have proof." The Oak Ridge County Courthouse buzzed with tension. News vans lined the street outside, reporters clutching microphones and checking makeup in pocket mirrors. Inside, the grand jury room had become ground zero for 2 decades of buried secrets. Sarah sat between Chen and the state attorney's lead investigator, Catherine Reeves, as a parade of witnesses filled in the gaps of the Phoenix Project. Her father's hard drive and Emma's hacked files had cracked the foundation, but now the walls were truly crumbling. "Tell us again about June 15th, 1982, Reeves asked the former nurse Mary Winters, who'd worked at the now-demolished Oak Ridge Medical Research Center. Mary's hands shook as she clutched her water glass. "They brought them in at night, always at night. Said they were volunteers for experimental treatments, but their faces—" She paused, steadying herself. "They were scared. Some were sick, yes, but others seemed perfectly healthy. And the death certificates? Dr. Anderson, the one who supposedly killed himself, he refused to sign them near the end. Said he couldn't live with it anymore. The next day, Judge Harrison came to the clinic with Mayor Phillips. They spent an hour in Dr. Anderson's office. After that, Mary wiped her eyes. After that, he signed whatever they put in front of him. Sarah felt Chen tense beside her. They'd spent the past week piecing together the timeline. The foundation hadn't started as a criminal enterprise. It began as a secret medical research program, using unwitting volunteers for experimental treatments. When people started dying, the money laundering operation grew to cover it up. The door opened and Emma slipped in, taking a seat behind Sarah. "Mom's next," she whispered. "She's ready to tell them everything." Clara Rodriguez walked in, clutching her preserved documents from that era. Her testimony would be crucial. Direct evidence of falsified records, of money-changing hands, of Harrison and Phillips building their power on a foundation of lies and bodies. "Mrs. Rodriguez," Reeves began, "please tell the grand jury about your first day working at the courthouse in 1982. Clara squared her shoulders. "I was just a filing clerk. They thought I was too junior to understand what I was processing. But I saw the patterns. Death certificates for people who had been perfectly healthy days before. Medical records that disappeared. And the money?" She opened her manila envelope. Every death had a corresponding payment. 6 figures, routed through shell companies. Payments from whom? Major pharmaceutical companies, defense contractors, anyone who wanted to test treatments without FDA oversight. Clara's voice hardened. Judge Harrison handled the legal paperwork. Mayor Phillips, just a city council member then, managed the relationships. When Michael Sullivan started investigating courthouse finances in 2005, he found my original files. He came to me, asked questions. And what happened then? I was too afraid to help him. I had a family, but I kept copies of everything. When he disappeared, I knew. She looked at Sarah. I knew someday someone would need them. The testimony continued for hours. Former Foundation employees, drawn out of hiding by the promise of immunity, detailed the evolution from medical conspiracy to criminal empire. Sarah learned how her father had discovered the connection between the 1982 deaths and the modern-day money laundering. 2 decades of corruption linked by the same players, the same signatures, the same pattern of buried truth. During a break, Chen showed Sarah a draft of his article. "This goes to print tomorrow, front page, full spread. Your father's story, the Phoenix Project, everything." Sarah scanned the headline. "Decades of Death. The Truth Behind Oak Ridge's Power Elite." "Harrison and Phillips will be arraigned next week," Reeves added, joining them. "But this is bigger than just them. We're getting calls from other towns, other jurisdictions. The Foundation's tendrils reach further than anyone imagined." Sarah's phone buzzed, a text from her mother. "Ready when you need me." Rachel had been hesitant to testify. Years of fear hard to overcome. But seeing Sarah's courage, hearing Clara's testimony, something had shifted. She was ready to tell her part of the story. "There's something else," Emma said quietly, showing Sarah her laptop. "I kept digging through the files I downloaded. Look at this." It was a list of names, dates of death matching the certificates Clara had preserved. But one name made Sarah's blood run cold. "Angela Harrison," she read. "The judge's wife?" Emma nodded. "She didn't die of cancer in '82 like everyone thought. She was one of the first test subjects. That's why Harrison joined the Foundation. They promised him access to experimental treatments. When she died anyway. He became part of the cover-up," Chen finished, "to protect their secrets and his own." Sarah thought about the layers of tragedy, how one man's desperate attempt to save his wife had spiraled into decades of corruption and death, how her father had died trying to expose it, how many lives had been destroyed to protect the powerful. The grand jury foreman called them back in. More witnesses, more testimonies. The web of lies unraveling thread by thread. Outside the courthouse, protesters held signs demanding justice. News helicopters circled overhead. Sarah watched it all through the windows, remembering that moment in the storage facility when everything changed. "Your father would be proud," Chen said softly, following her gaze. "This is exactly what he was fighting for." Sarah nodded, clutching her father's letter in her pocket. The truth hadn't died in 1982. It had waited, gathering strength, collecting allies until the right moment to emerge. As Clara finished her testimony, Sarah prepared to take the stand. She would tell them everything: the discovery in the attic, the confrontations with Harrison, the fire, the threats, the final showdown at the storage facility. But most importantly, she would speak for those who couldn't, the victims of 1982. Her father. Everyone who'd been silenced by the Foundation's power. The truth would finally have its day in court, and Oak Ridge would never be the same. The pre-trial hearing for Judge Harrison and Mayor Phillips was set for Monday morning, but the counterattack began Sunday night. Sarah was at home with her mother when the first news alert flashed across her phone. Questions arise about key evidence in Oak Ridge conspiracy case. Chen called immediately. "They're trying to get ahead of tomorrow's testimony. Turn on Channel 5. Sarah grabbed the remote, her stomach dropping as she saw Harrison's lawyer, James Whitfield, standing at a podium outside his office. "These allegations are based on unreliable evidence gathered by teenagers and a reporter desperate for a story," Whitfield was saying, his voice dripping with practiced concern. "The supposed hard drive, which no expert has verified, could easily have been fabricated. And let's remember who's making these accusations. A grieving daughter creating conspiracies to explain her father's tragic abandonment of his family." Rachel's hands clenched into fists. "Abandonment? Michael never—" "Wait," Sarah said, holding up her hand as Whitfield continued. "Furthermore, we have evidence that Mr. Chen paid witnesses to testify against my client. Bank records show suspicious transfers to both Clara Rodriguez and Mary Winters in the days before their grand jury appearances." Chen swore over the phone. "That's impossible. I never—" "They're fabricating evidence," Sarah realized, "just like they did in '82. The hits kept coming. Within hours, local news stations were running exclusive reports questioning the authenticity of the Phoenix Project documents. A medical expert appeared, claiming the death certificates showed no signs of foul play. Someone leaked Emma's school records, suggesting she had a history of behavioral issues that made her testimony unreliable. They're trying to destroy our credibility before the hearing, Chen said during their emergency meeting at the Tribune office. Classic Foundation playbook: muddy the waters, create doubt, make the truth seem unknowable. Emma paced anxiously. My mom's being pressured to recant her testimony. They're threatening to audit the courthouse, say she mishandled files for years. They came after me too, Mary Winters added, joining them with shaking hands. Someone broke into my house last night. Nothing taken, but... She didn't need to finish. The message was clear. Sarah stared at the wall of evidence they'd assembled. We need something they can't discredit. Something even their best lawyers can't explain away. What about the original research files? Clara suggested. From the medical center? They'd prove the experiments were real. They destroyed those years ago, Chen said. After Dr. Anderson's death. He stopped suddenly. Wait. Sarah, your father's letter. What exactly did it say about 1982? Sarah pulled out the worn paper. Check the old case files from '82. It goes deeper than anyone knows. But what if he didn't mean the courthouse files? Chen was getting excited. What if he meant his own case files, from the state attorney's office? Those would have been sealed with everything else, Emma pointed out. Not if he kept copies somewhere else, Sarah said slowly. Somewhere nobody would think to look. She turned to her mother. Mom, did Dad have an office outside the courthouse? Somewhere he worked late? Rachel frowned. He used to rent space above old Joe's hardware. Said he needed somewhere quiet to think. I'd bring him dinner sometimes. Is it still there? The building? It's abandoned now. Been empty for years. Sarah grabbed her keys. Not for long. The old hardware store was a shell of itself, windows boarded up, paint peeling. They had to break in through a back door, flashlights cutting through decades of dust. Up here, Rachel said, leading them to a narrow staircase. The office was small, just a desk and some filing cabinets. Everything was covered in thick dust, except, Sarah noticed, one ceiling tile that looked slightly askew. Chen, she called, pointing up. He helped her climb onto the desk. Sarah pushed the tile aside, reaching into the dark space above. Her fingers touched something plastic, a waterproof document box. Inside, they found everything. Not just copies of the Phoenix Project files, but something even more damning. Videotaped depositions from 1982. Dr. Anderson himself, speaking on camera about the experiments. Original consent forms with forged signatures. And most importantly, a handwritten ledger showing payments from the Foundation to Harrison, Phillips, and others, spanning 2 decades. They can't claim we fabricated these, Chen said, examining the deteriorating videotapes. The dating methods alone will prove they're original. Sarah's phone buzzed. Reeves. Harrison's lawyers filed a motion to dismiss. Hearing tomorrow morning. Need something solid. They're moving faster than we thought, Chen muttered. Good thing we are too. Sarah started gathering the evidence. Let's see them try to discredit this. But as they left the building, Sarah noticed a car parked across the street. Through the windshield, she caught a glimpse of a familiar face. Whitfield, Harrison's lawyer, speaking urgently into a phone. They followed us, she realized. They know what we found. Then we better make copies, Chen said grimly. Lots of copies. They worked through the night, digitizing everything, sending copies to trusted sources. By dawn, Sarah's father's final insurance policy was secure, the truth he'd hidden away, waiting for the right moment. As they drove to the courthouse Monday morning, Sarah watched the sun rise over Oak Ridge, the same sun that had risen on that day in 1982, when the Foundation claimed its first victims. The same sun that had risen the day her father disappeared. But today was different. Today, the light would finally reach the darkest corners of Oak Ridge's history. Ready? Chen asked as they parked. Sarah clutched the box of evidence in her lap, thinking of her father's courage, her mother's resilience, and all the lives destroyed by powerful men's secrets. They thought they could bury the truth, she said quietly. They forgot that some things refuse to stay buried. As they walked into the courthouse, Sarah saw Whitfield hurrying to meet with Harrison and Phillips. Let them scheme, she thought. Let them try to spin their lies one last time. The truth had waited 20 years for this moment. It could wait a few minutes more. The courtroom fell silent as Judge Elaine Martinez entered, her expression stern as she surveyed the packed gallery. On one side sat Harrison and Phillips, their expensive suits and practiced composure a stark contrast to the handcuffs binding their wrists. On the other, Sarah sat between Chen and Reeves, her father's recovered evidence box tucked safely beneath her chair. Before we proceed with the motion to dismiss, Judge Martinez began, I understand the prosecution has new evidence to present? Whitfield shot to his feet. Your Honor, any last-minute evidence is highly suspect. The defense hasn't had time to— The evidence isn't new, Your Honor, Reeves interrupted, standing. It's actually quite old, from 1982 to be precise. Evidence that was hidden, not destroyed, by a man who knew someday it would be needed. Judge Martinez nodded. Proceed. Sarah watched Harrison's face as Reeves began playing the first video deposition. Dr. Anderson appeared on the screen, clearly distressed but determined. The timestamp showed 3 days before his death. I can't be part of this anymore. His voice crackled through the speakers. The experiments weren't approved. The subjects didn't consent. Harrison and Phillips promised pharmaceutical companies results, took their money. People died. God help me. So many people died. Phillips leaned over to whisper something to Harrison, but the judge silenced him with a sharp gesture. His eyes were fixed on the screen, watching his past unfold. The foundation isn't just laundering money, Dr. Anderson continued. They're laundering deaths, making murders look like medical trials gone wrong. Harrison signs the orders. Phillips handles the payoffs. I've documented everything. The video cut off abruptly. 3 days later, Dr. Anderson would be found dead in his office. Your Honor, Reeves said, we have more. Mr. Chen? Chen approached the bench with the ledger they'd found. Financial records spanning 20 years. Every payment, every shell company, every connection between the foundation and the defendants. Objection! Whitfield was almost shouting now. These documents could easily be forgeries. We demand time to— The papers have already been authenticated, Reeves cut in smoothly. The aging of the ink, the paper type, all consistent with documents from 1982. But perhaps the most compelling evidence is yet to come. She turned to Sarah. Miss Mitchell, would you please take the stand? Sarah's heart pounded as she walked to the witness box. She could feel Harrison's cold stare, Phillips's barely contained rage, but she also felt something else, her father's presence, his courage flowing through her veins. Miss Mitchell, Reeves began, please tell the court about Angela Harrison. A sharp intake of breath from the defense table. Harrison's composure cracked for the first time. Angela Harrison was Judge Harrison's wife, Sarah said clearly. She didn't die of cancer in 1982 like the official record shows. She was one of the first test subjects in the Phoenix Project. Judge Harrison approved her participation, hoping to save her life. When she died from the experimental treatments, he helped cover it up. That's when he fully joined the foundation. Lies! Harrison's voice boomed through the courtroom. You don't know anything about Angela. Order! Judge Martinez's gavel cracked like thunder. I know because she left a letter, Sarah continued, her voice steady. A letter Dr. Anderson kept, and my father found. A letter explaining why she agreed to the experiments and how her husband's desperation to save her led him to make deals with the foundation. Reeves approached with the letter, preserved in a plastic sleeve. Your Honor, Mrs. Harrison's handwriting has been verified by 3 experts. Sarah watched as Judge Martinez read the letter, her expression growing grave. Harrison seemed to deflate in his chair, the weight of 20 years of guilt finally breaking him. She didn't want this, Sarah said softly, looking directly at Harrison. She wrote that she was afraid of what you might become in your grief, afraid that trying to save her would destroy you. You don't understand, Harrison whispered, his judicial authority stripped away, leaving only a broken man. After she died, they owned me. Phillips threatened to expose my role if I didn't help them. Then your father started asking questions. So you had him killed? Sarah's voice cracked slightly. No. Harrison looked up, his eyes wild. Phillips ordered that. I just looked the other way, like I'd been doing for years. The courtroom erupted. Phillips lunged at Harrison, restrained by bailiffs. Whitfield called for a recess, but it was too late. The truth was pouring out like a flood, washing away decades of lies. Judge Martinez restored order, then turned to Phillips. Mayor Phillips, do you have anything to say before I rule on this motion? Phillips straightened his tie, his politician's mask back in place. Your Honor, these accusations are... Save it, Robert. Harrison's voice was tired, defeated. It's over. Angela wouldn't want more people to die for our secrets. For the next hour, Harrison confessed everything. The original experiments, the shift to money laundering, the expanding criminal empire of the Foundation, Michael Sullivan's murder, ordered by Phillips but enabled by Harrison's silence. Sarah sat listening, tears rolling down her cheeks as her father's last case finally unraveled. Chen squeezed her shoulder supportively as Reeves presented the final piece of evidence, her father's own recorded testimony, hidden away with everything else, detailing exactly what he'd discovered. Motion to dismiss denied, Judge Martinez declared. This case will proceed to trial. Defendants to be held without bail given the severity of the charges and clear flight risk. As Harrison and Phillips were led away, Sarah caught Harrison's eye. For a moment, she saw past the corruption, past the crimes, to the grieving husband who'd lost his way trying to save his wife. I'm sorry, he mouthed silently. Sarah nodded once, thinking of all the lives destroyed by his choices. Sometimes sorry wasn't enough, but sometimes the truth was all the justice you could get. Outside the courtroom, reporters swarmed, cameras flashing, but Sarah's attention was drawn to the morning sun streaming through the courthouse windows, illuminating the dust motes in the air. Light, finally reaching the darkest corners of Oak Ridge's history, just as her father had hoped it would. The days following the hearing passed in a blur of headlines and revelations. Sarah sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by newspapers, each one carrying a different angle of the story that had shaken Oak Ridge to its core. Foundation conspiracy exposed. 2 decades of corruption unveiled. Mayor Phillips, Judge Harrison, face life sentences. Phoenix Project, the deadly truth behind Oak Ridge's darkest secret. Rachel placed a cup of coffee in front of her daughter, then sat down with her own. The bruises from the fire had faded, but the shadows under her eyes spoke of sleepless nights processing everything that had happened. They're releasing the names today, Rachel said quietly. All the victims from '82. Sarah nodded, pulling up the Tribune's website on her laptop. Chen had written the main article, treating each name with the dignity they'd been denied for 20 years. 47 people. 47 lives cut short, their deaths hidden behind falsified certificates and buried records. Angela Harrison's family reached out, Sarah said, scrolling through her emails. They want to meet, said they never believed the cancer story but couldn't prove anything. And now everyone knows the truth, about everything. Sarah closed the laptop, looking at her mother. Are you ready for tomorrow? Rachel took a shaky breath. The district attorney had scheduled a formal press conference where family members of Foundation victims would speak. Rachel would finally tell her story, their story, publicly. I don't know, she admitted. For so long, staying quiet felt like staying safe. Now ... Now we're free, Sarah finished softly. The doorbell rang. Emma stood outside, holding a thick manila envelope. Her family had moved back home after Phillips's arrest, the threats against them neutralized by his imprisonment. Mom found more files, she said, spreading papers across the table. Records of Foundation activities in other towns. Chen's already talking about a follow-up investigation. Sarah studied the documents. The Foundation's reach had extended far beyond Oak Ridge, its tendrils wrapping around other communities, other lives. But those stories would have to wait. For now, their town needed to heal. Her phone buzzed, a text from Reeves. Harrison's talking. Full confession. Phillips isn't happy. Good, Sarah muttered. The mayor had maintained his arrogant silence, but Harrison's breakdown in court had cracked the foundation's unified front. Other members were coming forward, making deals, exposing the full scope of the organization's crimes. "Sarah Mitchell?" A voice called from the front door, which Emma had left open. A woman in her 60s stood there clutching a photograph. "Yes?" "I'm Patricia Anderson, Dr. Anderson's widow." Sarah felt her breath catch. Rachel quickly pulled out a chair, inviting Patricia to sit. "I've wanted to meet you for so long," Patricia said, her voice trembling. "When I saw the news, everything you uncovered, David tried to stop them, you know. He kept evidence, just like your father did." "We found his video testimony," Sarah said gently. "It helped bring down the foundation." Patricia placed the photograph on the table. It showed Dr. Anderson with Michael Sullivan, both men smiling, unaware of what awaited them. "They were working together at the end," Patricia explained. "David knew your father was investigating the finances. He wanted to help, to make things right. But Phillips... She wiped her eyes. "The day before David died, he told me if anything happened to him, the truth would come out eventually. He believed that completely." Sarah thought of her father's hidden evidence, Dr. Anderson's preserved testimony, all the pieces waiting to be found. Two men who'd sacrificed everything to expose the truth, trusting that someday someone would finish what they started. "The DA wants to rename the courthouse plaza," Emma mentioned. "The Sullivan-Anderson Memorial Plaza, to honor their sacrifice." Patricia smiled through her tears. David would have liked that. He always said the truth was worth any price. The afternoon passed with Patricia sharing stories about Dr. Anderson and Michael Sullivan's final days. Each revelation filled in another piece of the puzzle, helping Sarah understand the courage it had taken to stand against the foundation. Later, as the sun set over Oak Ridge, Sarah walked to the park where her father had hidden his final message. The old gazebo needed paint, but someone had left flowers on its steps. A makeshift memorial had sprung up, photos of foundation victims surrounded by candles and notes. Chen found her there, carrying a proof of tomorrow's paper. "Front page," he said, handing it to her. The headline read, "Healing begins. Oak Ridge confronts its past." "Do you think it's really over?" Sarah asked. "The foundation?" "Yes. The healing process? That's just beginning." Chen sat beside her on the gazebo steps. "Your father and Dr. Anderson started something bigger than themselves. They knew the truth would need guardians, people willing to carry it forward." Sarah touched one of the victims' photos gently. "Everyone deserves to know what happened to their loved ones. And now they will." Chen stood, offering his hand. "Ready for tomorrow?" Sarah took one last look at the memorial, at the faces of those lost to the foundation's greed and corruption. Her father had died protecting the truth. Dr. Anderson had died preserving it. Now it was her turn to help tell it. "Ready," she said, standing tall. As they walked away, the setting sun painted the gazebo in shades of gold. 2 decades of darkness were ending, and a new chapter in Oak Ridge's history was beginning. A chapter written in truth, not shadows. A chapter her father would have been proud to read. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.